In the depths of Yorkshire's moors stands a crumbling manor, its windows like dead eyes staring into eternity. For 3 centuries, the Ravenscroft name has whispered through village streets like a prayer or a warning. Some legacies are written in blood, some curses refuse to die. The autumn of 1847 brought more than falling leaves to the village of Thornwick. It brought Eleanor Whitmore, the last living soul who remembered the Ravenscroft family before their name became synonymous with tragedy. At 83, her weathered hands trembled not from age, but from memories that had haunted her for decades. Eleanor sat by her cottage window, watching the morning mist roll across the Yorkshire moors toward the abandoned Ravenscroft manor. The locals had long since stopped speaking the family's name aloud, crossing themselves whenever they passed the iron gates that had rusted shut 30 years prior. But Eleanor remembered when those gates gleamed black as midnight, when carriages rolled through them carrying guests who laughed and danced until dawn. She remembered Cornelius Ravenscroft, the patriarch who had built the manor in 1547 with stones quarried from an ancient burial ground. The local clergy had warned him against disturbing the sacred earth, but Cornelius was a man who bent the world to his will. He had emerged from the Scottish borderlands with wealth that seemed to multiply in darkness, speaking little of his origins but carrying himself with the bearing of nobility. The villagers had welcomed the Ravenscrofts initially. The family brought commerce, employment, and a touch of grandeur to their humble settlement. The manor rose like a dark jewel against the moorland sky, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven while its foundations sank deep into cursed ground. Local craftsmen carved gargoyles with faces that seemed to watch, their stone eyes following their visitors with uncomfortable intensity. But Eleanor had been there the night everything changed. She had been 17, working as a scullery maid in the manor's vast kitchens when the first signs appeared. The wine had turned to blood in the cellars, the portraits in the great hall had begun to weep tears of crimson, and in the dead of night footsteps echoed through empty corridors where no living soul walked. The servants whispered of shadows that moved independently of their sources, of cold spots that appeared without explanation, of voices speaking in tongues that predated English itself. But it was the children who suffered first, the Ravenscroft heirs who began to sicken and die one by one, their young faces growing gaunt as if something was slowly draining their very essence. Eleanor had fled before the worst of it began, her survival instinct overwhelming her need for employment. She was the only servant to escape with her sanity intact, carrying secrets that had festered in her mind like infected wounds for 30 years. Now, as death approached on silent feet, she felt compelled to speak. The curse demanded witnesses, and she would not take its story to the grave. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed to uncover the truth, or run like Eleanor? To understand the curse that would consume the Ravenscroft lineage, one must journey back to 1547, when Cornelius Ravenscroft first set foot on Yorkshire soil. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as something far more dangerous, a man running from his past, carrying secrets that would poison the very ground beneath his feet. Cornelius had fled the Scottish Highlands following the execution of his father, Magnus Ravenscroft, for crimes that the records dare not specify in detail. The official documents preserved in the Edinburgh archives speak only of practices most foul and unholy and commerce with entities beyond Christian comprehension. Magnus had been burned at the stake in the winter of 1546, his screams echoing across the frozen loch as his son watched from the shadows. But Magnus Ravenscroft had been more than a mere practitioner of dark arts. He had been the keeper of something ancient, something that predated Christianity's arrival in Scotland. Family documents discovered centuries later in the manor's sealed chambers revealed that the Ravenscrofts had served as guardians of a primordial force that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each generation's blood sacrifice. When Cornelius fled south to Yorkshire, he carried with him more than gold and jewels. Hidden in his carriage was an obsidian box, no larger than a prayer book, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. The box contained what the family called the Compact, a binding agreement signed in blood by Magnus Ravenscroft, and something that required no earthly signature. The site Cornelius chose for his manor was no accident. Local historians had documented strange occurrences there for generations, livestock found drained of blood, crops that withered despite fertile soil, and women who disappeared on moonless nights. The ancient burial mounds that dotted the landscape were already corrupted, their stone circles worn smooth by centuries of unhallowed rituals. When Cornelius commissioned the manor's construction, he insisted on specific architectural elements that seemed to serve no practical purpose. Hidden chambers were built into the foundation, accessible only through concealed passages. The Great Hall was designed with acoustic properties that amplified whispers while muffling screams. And beneath it all, in the deepest cellar, a room was carved directly into the bedrock, a room where no Christian cross could maintain its form, where iron rusted within hours, and where shadows gathered even in blazing candlelight. The local stonemasons who worked on the project began experiencing nightmares within weeks. He died in construction accidents that defied explanation. The lead architect, Thomas Grimwald, was found one morning in his cottage, his hair turned white overnight, his mind shattered beyond repair. He spent his remaining years drawing obsessive sketches of creatures that had no names in any earthly tongue. By winter's end, Ravenscroft Manor stood complete, its dark presence casting a shadow that seemed to extend far beyond its physical boundaries. If you lived in Thornwick then, would you have welcomed the Ravenscrofts as neighbours, or sensed the darkness they brought with them? In the spring of 1549, Cornelius Ravenscroft took a bride, and with her marriage began the true manifestation of the family curse. Isabella Fairfax arrived from London, a beauty of 17 summers whose father owed Cornelius a debt that could only be paid in flesh and dowry. She came willingly, enchanted by tales of Yorkshire's wild beauty and her husband's mysterious wealth. Isabella's wedding portrait, painted by the renowned master Giovanni Torretti, still hangs in the manor's ruins today. Those brave enough to venture into the abandoned halls speak of how her painted eyes seem to follow visitors, how tears appear to glisten on her porcelain cheeks when viewed by candlelight. But in 1549, she posed radiantly, unaware that she was signing her own death warrant with marriage vows. The newlyweds' happiness lasted precisely 13 days. On the 14th night of their marriage, Isabella began to dream of stone corridors that didn't exist in the manor's blueprints, of voices calling her name from deep beneath the earth. She would wake gasping, her nightgown soaked with perspiration that smelled of grave soil and ancient decay. The servants noticed changes first. Isabella's appetite vanished, though she showed no signs of illness. Her reflection in mirrors began to fade, becoming translucent, and as if she was slowly being erased from the world. Most disturbing were the marks that appeared on her skin each morning, small puncture wounds that formed intricate patterns, always in places her clothing would conceal. Cornelius grew increasingly possessive, forbidding Isabella from leaving the manor grounds. When she begged to visit her family in London, he flew into rages that shook the very foundations of the house. The servants whispered that his eyes had begun to change color, shifting from brown to an unsettling amber that seemed to glow in darkness. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, summoned from York to examine Isabella's declining health, documented symptoms that defied medical understanding. Her blood ran cold to the touch, yet her pulse raced like a frightened bird's. She spoke in her sleep of the watchers below and the price of power. Most chilling were the moments when she would stare into empty corners of rooms, conversing with invisible presences in a language that predated English. The pregnancy came as both blessing and curse. Isabella's health stabilized temporarily, but she began experiencing visions that left her screaming in terror. She drew obsessive sketches of creatures with too many limbs, of altars stained with substances that weren't entirely blood, of children who aged backwards until they crumbled into dust. On the night before her labor began, Isabella managed to smuggle a letter to her sister in London. The letter, discovered in family archives centuries later, contained a desperate plea. The child must not be born here. The watchers hunger, and Cornelius feeds them willingly. I fear what grows within me is not entirely human. She never had the chance to send it. What would you have done in Isabella's place? Tried to escape or stayed to protect your unborn child from an even darker fate? Isabella Ravenscroft's labor lasted 3 days and 2 nights, her screams echoing through the manor like the wailing of banshees. The midwives summoned from the village fled before the ordeal ended, crossing themselves and refusing to speak of what they had witnessed in the birthing chamber. Only Mrs. Mordaunt, the manor's housekeeper, remained to assist in the delivery that would forever alter the Ravenscroft bloodline. When Damien Ravenscroft finally entered the world on October 31st, 1549, the very air seemed to recoil from his presence. The child was born with a full head of black hair and eyes that gleamed with intelligence far beyond his moments of life. Most unsettling was his silence. No infant's cry announced his arrival, only an otherworldly stillness that made even hardened servants uncomfortable. Isabella took one look at her son and began to weep tears of blood. The sight of the newborn sent her into convulsions so violent that 3 men were required to hold her to the bed. She spoke in that ancient tongue that had plagued her dreams, her voice rising and falling in cadences that suggested prayer, or perhaps invocation. Mrs. Mordaunt later swore that the child's eyes followed the sound of his mother's voice with an awareness that chilled her to the bone. Within hours of the birth, strange phenomena began manifesting throughout the manor. Candles extinguished themselves in the child's presence, only to reignite with flames that burned blue and cold. The temperature in the nursery dropped so drastically that ice formed on the windows despite the roaring fire. Most disturbing were the sounds, soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, speaking words of welcome in languages that had been dead for millennia. Cornelius displayed an obsessive devotion to his heir that bordered on worship. He spent hours in the nursery, conducting rituals that Mrs. Mordaunt glimpsed through keyhole observations. Strange symbols were carved into the cradle's wood, filled with substances that gleamed like liquid mercury. The child wore amulets of black stone that seemed to absorb light, creating pockets of absolute darkness around his tiny form. Isabella's mental state deteriorated rapidly following the birth. She refused to hold or feed the child, claiming that his touch burned her skin like acid. The wet nurse brought from the village lasted only 2 nights before fleeing in terror, reporting that the infant's eyes held the intelligence of something ancient and malevolent. A succession of nurses followed, each departing more quickly than the last. By the child's first month, Isabella had begun planning her escape. Letters found hidden in her chambers reveal her growing desperation and a plan to flee to a convent in France, where her cousin served as abbess. But the watchers below had invested too much in the Ravenscroft heir to allow such defection. The night Isabella attempted her escape would become the first of many tragedies that would define the family's cursed legacy. Imagine being one of those servants. Would you have stayed for the wages, or trusted your instincts and fled into the night? The morning of November 30th, 1549, dawned grey and bitter across the Yorkshire moors. Isabella Ravenscroft's body was discovered by a shepherd boy at first light, sprawled across the ancient stone circle known as the Witch's Ring, 3 miles from the manor. Her nightgown was pristine white except for the crimson stains that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental. The local magistrate, Sir Geoffrey Blackthorne, conducted an investigation that raised more questions than it answered. Isabella's bare feet showed no signs of the journey across rough moorland. Her body bore no wounds that could account for the blood, yet she had clearly died from massive blood loss. Most puzzling was her expression. Not the rictus of terror one might expect, but an almost peaceful resignation, as if she had finally found release. Cornelius's grief seemed genuine to outside observers, but the servants noticed troubling details. He showed no surprise at news of his wife's death, merely nodding as if receiving expected information. When asked about Isabella's state of mind, he spoke of her growing weakness and inability to embrace her destiny as mother to the Ravenscroft heir. The baby, now barely a month old, displayed disturbing reactions to his mother's death. Mrs. Mordaunt reported that young Damien became increasingly agitated whenever anyone mentioned Isabella, his tiny fists clenching as if in rage. More unsettling was his apparent recognition of his mother's belongings. When shown Isabella's jewelry or clothing, the infant would reach toward them with an intensity that seemed almost adult in its focus. Dr. Blackwood's examination of Isabella's corpse revealed anomalies that he documented in private notes, never intended for official records. Her blood had crystallized in her veins, forming patterns that resembled runic inscriptions. Her heart showed signs of having been drained systematically over weeks. not suddenly. Most disturbing was the condition of her reproductive organs, which bore evidence of ongoing trauma that suggested some form of ritualistic abuse. The inquest ruled Isabella's death a tragic accident, likely the result of sleepwalking during a period of postpartum melancholy. But village gossip told different stories. Shepherds reported seeing lights moving across the moors in the weeks before Isabella's death, forming processions that seemed to converge on the witch's ring. Others spoke of hearing Isabella's voice carried on night winds, pleading for help in words that froze listeners' blood. The stone circle where Isabella died had been a place of power long before the Ravenscrofts arrived in Yorkshire. Archaeological evidence suggested continuous use for ritualistic purposes spanning over 2 millennia. The addition of Isabella's life force to this ancient nexus created something that local wise women recognized as a summoning beacon, a call to entities that existed in the spaces between worlds. Within days of Isabella's funeral, strange visitors began arriving at Ravenscroft Manor under cover of darkness. Tell me in the comments, do you think Isabella's death was suicide, murder, or something far more sinister? In the weeks following Isabella's death, Ravenscroft Manor became a beacon for individuals who dwelt in society's shadows. They arrived silently, traveling only by night, their faces hidden beneath heavy cloaks and broad-brimmed hats. The villagers of Thornwick learned quickly not to ask questions about these nocturnal visitors, though their very presence seemed to poison the air with an undercurrent of dread. Mrs. Mordaunt's private journals, discovered centuries later bricked up in the manor's walls, provide the only surviving account of these mysterious gatherings. She described figures who seemed to glide rather than walk, whose shadows fell in directions that defied the light sources present. Some spoke in accents she couldn't place, using words that made her ears ring painfully. Others maintained complete silence, communicating through gestures that suggested familiarity with practices no Christian soul should know. The meetings took place in the manor's deepest cellars, in chambers that Cornelius had sealed from his household staff. Strange lights emanated from beneath the house during these gatherings, not the warm glow of candles or torches, but a cold blue radiance that leaked through floorboards and cast eerie shadows in the rooms above. The temperature throughout the manor would drop precipitously during these sessions, despite roaring fires in every hearth. Young Damien seemed to thrive during these gatherings. Mrs. Mordaunt noted that the infant displayed unusual vitality on nights when the visitors came, his eyes bright with an intelligence that unnerved even his devoted nursemaid. The child would lie in his cradle, perfectly still but obviously alert, as if listening to conversations taking place below. Most disturbing was his apparent ability to predict these meetings. He would become agitated hours before the first visitor arrived, settling into watchful calm only when the rituals commenced. The village began experiencing phenomena that coincided with these gatherings. Livestock were found dead in perfect circles, their blood drained but their bodies unmarked. Wells that had provided clean water for generations suddenly turned brackish with a metallic taste that reminded locals unpleasantly of copper pennies. Children reported nightmares so vivid they would wake screaming, describing creatures with too many eyes and voices that called their names from beneath the earth. Father Michael Donnelly, the parish priest, attempted to bless the manor grounds during this period. He made it no farther than the front gates before collapsing in what witnesses described as a seizure. When he recovered consciousness, his hair had turned completely white, and he spoke of seeing legions of the damned rising from the manor's foundations. He refused to approach the property again, instead spending his remaining years creating protective wards around the village church. The gatherings continued for 6 months, each one seeming to draw more power from the ancient burial grounds beneath the manor. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. But their purpose had been accomplished. If you lived in Thornwick during this period, would you have tried to investigate these mysterious meetings or kept your distance and prayed for protection? By his first birthday, Damien Ravenscroft had developed into a child who defied nature's laws. While other infants struggled to sit upright, he moved with predatory grace, his dark eyes tracking movement with the focus of a hunter. Mrs. Mordaunt's journal entries from this period reveal her growing unease with her young charge, though her loyalty to the Ravenscroft family kept her from abandoning her post. The child's intelligence manifested in ways that chilled the household staff. Before he could properly speak, Damien would point to specific stones in the manor's walls, indicating secret passages that even Cornelius seemed unaware of. When these stones were pressed in the sequence the child indicated, hidden chambers revealed themselves, containing artifacts that predated the manor's construction by centuries. Damien's first words were not "mama" or "papa," but phrases in that ancient tongue that had haunted his mother's dreams. Mrs. Mordaunt transcribed these utterances phonetically, creating a record that modern linguists would later identify as corrupted Latin mixed with Celtic dialects that had been extinct for over a millennium. The child seemed to understand the meaning of these words instinctively, using them to communicate desires that no human infant should possess. The wet nurses brought to care for Damien rarely lasted more than a few nights. They reported that the child would stare at them with an intensity that made their skin crawl, as if he were evaluating them for purposes beyond mere sustenance. Some claimed that his touch left marks on their skin, not bruises or scratches, but symbols that resembled brands, appearing hours after contact and fading only when the women left the manor's grounds. Cornelius's relationship with his son bordered on reverence. He would spend hours in the nursery conducting what appeared to be lessons rather than typical father-child interactions. The child would listen with rapt attention as Cornelius read from books written in scripts that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. These texts, bound in leather that felt unpleasantly warm to the touch, contained knowledge that had been forbidden by church and crown alike. By 18 months, Damien had begun displaying abilities that transcended human limitations. He could predict when visitors would arrive hours before they appeared. Animals fled from his presence, hers. Horses would rear and bolt when he approached, while dogs would whimper and hide until he passed. Most disturbing was his apparent ability to influence the behavior of others through sustained eye contact, compelling servants to perform tasks they had no memory of undertaking. The village children began experiencing night terrors during this period, all describing the same recurring dream, a dark-haired child standing at their bedroom windows, beckoning them to come outside and play games that would last forever. Several children went missing that winter, their disappearances coinciding with nights when strange lights were seen moving between the village and the manor. Would you trust your instincts about a child who seemed wrong from birth, or convince yourself that you were imagining the danger? When Damien reached his 7th year, Cornelius made arrangements that would shape his son's destiny in ways that even the Dark Patriarch could not fully comprehend. Instead of hiring local tutors, he enrolled the boy in Grimthorne Academy, a private institution nestled in the Scottish Highlands that catered to children from families with particular traditions. Grimthorne Academy existed in the shadows of legitimate education, its location known only to families who dealt in secrets older than recorded history. The school's founder, Archimedes Grimthorne, had established the institution in 1452 as a place where children of unusual heritage could receive instruction in subjects that conventional schools would never acknowledge. The curriculum included languages that predated human civilization, mathematics based on geometric principles that warped space itself, and sciences that explored the boundaries between life and death. The journey to Grimthorne took 3 days through increasingly desolate terrain. Mrs. Mordaunt, who accompanied young Damien as his nursemaid, entered the trip in journal entries that revealed her growing apprehension. The roads became mere tracks, winding through forests, where the trees grew in patterns that suggested intentional cultivation. The few villages they passed seemed populated by individuals who watched their carriage with eyes that held too much knowledge. Grimthorne Academy itself was a marvel of architecture that seemed to shift depending on the viewer's angle. Built into the face of a mountain, its spires and towers followed the natural rock formations while adding elements that challenged perception. Windows appeared in walls where moments before there had been solid stone. Corridors seemed to extend or contract based on the walker's intent. The building existed as a physical manifestation of the fluid relationship between reality and possibility. Damien adapted to the academy with an ease that disturbed even his experienced instructors. While other students struggled with basic concepts, he grasped advanced principles intuitively. His essays on subjects like the manipulation of temporal flows and communion with entities beyond the veil demonstrated knowledge that should have taken decades to acquire. His practical examinations in what the school termed applied metaphysics produced results that forced the faculty to reevaluate their understanding of possibility. The other students at Grimthorne came from families across Europe, each carrying bloodlines that traced back to practitioners of arts that Christianity had driven underground. There was Madeline Blackwood from the Scottish borders, whose ancestors had served as intermediaries between human and fey communities. Victor von Habsburg brought knowledge of alchemical traditions that had funded his family's rise to power. Cassandra Orsini carried the legacy of Roman mystery cults that had survived in hidden enclaves. But even among these exceptional children, Damien stood apart. His fellow students reported dreams where he appeared as their instructor, teaching lessons that they would later discover in their formal classes. Some claimed he could be in multiple locations simultaneously, conversing with different groups while maintaining perfect continuity of thought. By his third year at Grimthorne, Damien had become something that transcended the category of student. Imagine sending your child to such a school. Would the promise of exceptional education outweigh the risk of losing their humanity? After 5 years at Grimthorne Academy, Damien Ravenscroft returned to Yorkshire in the autumn of 1561, transformed into something that barely resembled the child who had departed. At 12 years old, he possessed the bearing of an adult and the knowledge of someone who had lived multiple lifetimes. Mrs. Mordaunt, now aged beyond her years from the strain of maintaining the manor in his absence, barely recognized the young master who stepped from the carriage. Damien had grown tall for his age, his frame lean but possessing an unsettling strength that became apparent in casual gestures. His dark hair had developed premature streaks of silver that caught light in ways that seemed to bend illumination to his will. Most striking were his eyes, which had deepened from their childhood brown to an amber that seemed to hold flecks of gold that moved independently of his gaze. The reunion between father and son took place in Cornelius's private study, behind doors that had been warded with symbols that glowed faintly in response to Damien's presence. Their conversation lasted until dawn, conducted in multiple languages that Mrs. Mordaunt could identify but not understand. Servants reported that the manor's temperature fluctuated wildly during this meeting, creating pockets of Arctic cold adjacent to areas where the very air seemed to shimmer with heat. Damien's assessment of the manor's condition revealed capabilities that extended far beyond normal perception. He identified structural weaknesses in walls that had been concealed by careful masonry, located hidden chambers that even Cornelius had forgotten, and detected the presence of artifacts that had been walled up decades earlier. His understanding of the property's mystical geography was so complete that he corrected several of his father's ritual preparations, improving their effectiveness in ways that produced visible results. The village of Thornwick reacted to Damien's return with a mixture of curiosity and instinctive fear. Children who had played near the manor's boundaries now refused to venture within sight of its walls. Livestock would not graze in fields that bordered the Ravenscroft property, despite the rich grass that grew there. Even the local birds seemed to avoid the area, creating an unnatural silence that pressed against the ears like a physical presence. Damien's first public appearance was at Sunday service in the village church, an event that Father Donnelly later described as a test of his faith that nearly broke his spirit. The young Ravenscroft sat quietly throughout the service, but his presence created disturbances that rippled through the congregation. Holy water began to boil in its font. Candles flickered in patterns that spelled out words in scripts that predated Christianity. The stained glass windows depicting scenes of salvation began to weep condensation that stained the glass with patterns resembling hieroglyphs. Most unsettling was Damien's effect on the other worshippers. Several parishioners reported experiencing visions during the service, glimpsing scenes of rituals that took place in chambers beneath the church itself. Tell me in the comments, would you have welcomed Damien back to your community or recognized him as a threat that needed to be stopped? As Damien entered his 18th year in 1567, Cornelius began orchestrating a union that would ensure the continuation of the Ravenscroft bloodline while strengthening their connection to the ancient forces they served. The bride chosen for this purpose was Evangeline Ashford, daughter of Lord Marcus Ashford, whose family controlled vast estates across northern England and harboured secrets that complemented the Ravenscroft legacy perfectly. The Ashford lineage traced its origins to Saxon nobility who had served as intermediaries between human communities and entities that dwelt in sacred groves and stone circles. Unlike the Ravenscrofts' more aggressive approach to supernatural communion, the Ashfords had maintained their power through careful negotiation and tribute, preserving knowledge that other families had lost to time or persecution. Evangeline had been trained from birth in arts that prepared her specifically for marriage to someone of Damien's unique heritage. When Evangeline arrived at Ravenscroft Manor for her initial meeting with her intended husband, she brought with her a dowry that consisted not of gold or land, but of artifacts that resonated with power older than human memory. Ancient texts written on materials that weren't quite parchment, jewelry crafted from metals that seemed to absorb light, and most precious of all, a collection of preserved specimens that represented species that official naturalists insisted had never existed. The courtship between Damien and Evangeline unfolded like a careful dance between equals who recognized each other's dangerous potential. Their conversations, conducted in gardens where flowers bloomed out of season and shadows fell upward, covered topics that would have driven conventional minds to madness. They discussed the manipulation of bloodlines across generations, the cultivation of psychic abilities in offspring, and the delicate balance required to serve entities that viewed human lifespans as momentary flickers. Evangeline possessed abilities that complemented Damien's own supernatural talents. Where he could commune with entities that existed beyond human perception, she could interpret their communications and translate otherworldly concepts into actionable plans. Her training in what the Ashford family termed bloodline enhancement meant that she understood how to bear children who would inherit specific combinations of supernatural gifts while maintaining enough humanity to function in the physical world. The engagement ceremony took place during the winter solstice of 1567, conducted according to traditions that predated Christianity by millennia. The ritual required the participation of 13 witnesses, each representing a different aspect of the power that would flow through the union. Representatives from ancient families across Europe attended, traveling in secret to ensure that their participation remained hidden from church and crown authorities. The ceremony itself transformed the manor's Great Hall into something that existed partially outside normal space-time. Guests reported that the event seemed to last simultaneously for moments and for hours, with conversations beginning at sunset and concluding at dawn despite the apparent passage of only minutes. As the engaged couple sealed their commitment with vows spoken in tongues that made reality shiver, the foundation was laid for offspring who would surpass even their extraordinary parents. If you were invited to such an engagement ceremony, would you attend to witness history or stay away to preserve your sanity? The marriage of Damien Ravenscroft and Evangeline Ashford on Midsummer's Eve 1568 represented more than the union of two individuals. It was the joining of bloodlines that had been carefully cultivated for centuries to produce offspring capable of transcending human limitations. The ceremony took place in the ancient stone circle where Isabella Ravenscroft had died nearly 2 decades earlier, the site having been consecrated through her sacrifice to serve as a focal point for otherworldly energies. Preparate. Irons for the wedding began months in advance, requiring modifications to the stone circle that enhanced its natural properties as a conduit between dimensions. Cornelius supervised the installation of additional megaliths, quarried from sites across Britain that had served as centers of power for pre-Christian civilizations. Each stone was positioned according to astronomical calculations that aligned the circle with celestial events that occurred only once every several centuries. The guest list read like a registry of European families who maintained traditions that official history had declared extinct. The von Habsburgs sent Victor, now a master of alchemical arts, who had transmuted base metals into substances that existed in theoretical states only. The Blackwoods arrived from Scotland with Madeline, whose communion with entities that dwelt between the worlds had granted her abilities that challenged the boundaries between life and death. From the Italian peninsula came members of families who had preserved Roman mystery cult practices in hidden enclaves, bringing with them artifacts that had been blessed by gods whose names were forbidden to speak aloud. The ceremony itself began at sunset and continued until dawn, following ritualistic patterns that had been handed down through generations of practitioners who understood that certain unions required otherworldly sanction. Evangeline wore a gown woven from materials that seemed to shift between textures, sometimes appearing as silk, other times resembling scales or feathers that moved independently of any breeze. Damien's attire incorporated symbols that had been embroidered with threads spun from metals that naturally occurring elements could not produce. The vows exchanged between bride and groom were spoken in languages that predated human civilization, their meaning understood not through translation but through direct transmission from entities that served as witnesses to the union. As the words were spoken, the stone circle began to resonate with harmonics that reached frequencies beyond human hearing, creating vibrations that could be felt in the bones of all present. The exchange of rings marked the moment when the ceremony transcended mere human ritual. The bands, forged from alloys that contained materials from meteorites and deep earth sources, began to glow with inner light as they were placed. Witnesses reported that the couple seemed to become translucent for several moments, as if their physical forms were temporarily optional. When dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors, Damien and Evangeline Ravenscroft had become something more than married. They had achieved a fusion of souls that would allow them to create offspring who inherited abilities from both bloodlines while developing new capabilities that neither parent possessed alone. What would you have felt witnessing such a union, awe at the power being unleashed or terror at what it might produce? 9 months after their otherworldly wedding, Evangeline Ravenscroft gave birth to twins who would embody the culmination of centuries of careful bloodline cultivation. Born during a lunar eclipse on March 15, 1569, Lucian and Seraphina Ravenscroft entered the world amid phenomena that transformed the delivery chamber into something that existed partially outside normal space-time. The birth took place in the manor's deepest sanctum, a chamber that had been carved directly into the bedrock and enhanced with geometric patterns that focused supernatural energies. Evangeline's labor was attended not only by skilled midwives but by practitioners who understood that this delivery required management of forces that conventional medicine couldn't address. The chamber filled with harmonics that resonated at frequencies that seemed to originate from within the earth itself, creating vibrations that eased the birthing process while simultaneously announcing the arrival of the twins to entities that dwelt beyond human perception. Lucian, the firstborn by mere minutes, emerged with hair so dark it seemed to absorb light and eyes that held depths, suggesting an intelligence that transcended his moments of life. Unlike his grandfather's generation, he announced his arrival with a cry that harmonized with the chamber's mystical resonances, creating sound patterns that were immediately recognized by the attending practitioners as communication in tongues that predated human language. Seraphina followed her brother into the world with features that seemed to shift between human and something more refined, her bone structure suggesting ancestry that included bloodlines from species that official science insisted had never existed. Her eyes opened immediately upon birth, focusing with a clarity that indicated full consciousness rather than the blank awareness typical of newborns. Most remarkably, she seemed to respond to her brother's otherworldly communications, the twins establishing a form of interaction that bypassed conventional speech entirely. The twins' effect on their environment became apparent within hours of birth. The temperature in their nursery stabilized at levels that seemed to exist independently of external heating sources. Candles in their presence burned with flames that produced no smoke while generating light that illuminated details invisible under normal illumination. Metal objects near their cradles began to develop patinas that resembled tarnish but created patterns too intricate to be natural oxidation. Evangeline's recovery from childbirth proceeded at a rate that astounded even practitioners familiar with enhanced healing techniques. Within days, she had regained not only her physical strength, but had developed new abilities that seemed to arise from her experience of carrying and delivering children whose heritage transcended normal human genetics. She reported dreams where she communicated with versions of herself from alternate timelines, gathering knowledge about child-rearing practices that would nurture the twins' supernatural development while maintaining enough humanity to allow them to function in the physical world. Cornelius, now a grandfather at the age of 62, recognized that the twins represented the fulfillment of ambitions that had driven the Ravenscroft family for generations. But he also understood that power of this magnitude would inevitably attract attention from forces that viewed such development as either opportunity or threat. How do you think you would have reacted to meeting these extraordinary infants, with wonder at their gifts or fear of their potential? By their 5th year, Lucian and Serafina Ravenscroft had developed abilities that forced their parents to reconsider the nature of human potential itself. The twins demonstrated capabilities that transcended individual supernatural gifts, their shared consciousness allowing them to accomplish feats that neither could achieve alone. Their education required instruction from practitioners across Europe who specialized in nurturing children whose heritage included bloodlines from entities that existed beyond normal dimensional boundaries. The twins' most remarkable ability was their capacity for what Evangeline termed synchronized manifestation, the creation of physical effects through combined mental focus that bypassed natural laws entirely. They could alter the temperature of objects through concentrated attention, cause flowers to bloom in patterns that spelled out messages in ancient scripts, and most unsettling to outside observers, seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously when their shared consciousness divided its attention between different objectives. Lucian's individual talents leaned toward communion with entities that existed in spaces between dimensions, his conversations with otherworldly presences providing the family with information about events that hadn't yet occurred in linear time. His predictions proved accurate with disturbing consistency, allowing the Ravenscrofts to anticipate everything from weather patterns to the movements of individuals who posed threats to family interests. By age 7, he was conducting negotiations with entities whose cooperation required offerings that Cornelius could barely comprehend, despite his decades of supernatural practice. Serafina's gifts manifested as an ability to manipulate the fundamental forces that maintained reality's structure. She could cause stone to become temporarily liquid, allowing her to reshape architectural elements through touch alone. Metal objects would reconfigure themselves in her presence, taking forms that served purposes she envisioned without conscious effort. Most remarkably, she seemed capable of healing injuries by accelerating the body's natural recovery processes to rates that compressed weeks of healing into moments. The twins' effect on the local population became increasingly difficult to conceal as they matured. Children from the village began experiencing shared dreams where Lucian and Serafina appeared as playmates who taught games that involved manipulation of natural elements. Several village children developed abilities that mimicked simplified versions of the twins' powers, creating phenomena that the local clergy struggled to explain within Christian doctrine. Father Donnelly, now in his 70s and bearing the physical toll of decades spent maintaining protective wards around his parish, attempted an exorcism of the manor grounds in the spring of 1574. The ritual failed catastrophically when the twins, observing from the manor's windows, began laughing in harmonies that shattered the priest's concentration. The protexine, symbols he had inscribed in the earth began rearranging themselves into patterns that enhanced rather than blocked supernatural energies, creating a permanent amplification field around the property that increased the effectiveness of all mystical practices conducted within its boundaries. The twins had reached an age where their power could no longer be contained within family boundaries. Their influence was beginning to reshape the very fabric of reality in Yorkshire, preparing the ground for manifestations that would transcend anything the Ravenscroft bloodline had previously achieved. Tell me in the comments, would you have tried to befriend children with such extraordinary abilities, or kept your own children far away from their influence? As Lucian and Serafina entered their teenage years in 1582, their parents faced the challenge of providing education that could nurture gifts that had evolved beyond anything documented in the family's archives. Traditional tutoring had become inadequate by their 10th year, as the twins absorbed information at rates that suggested direct knowledge transfer rather than conventional learning. Their questions probed areas of study that existed at the intersection of multiple disciplines, requiring instruction from individuals who had dedicated their lives to exploring the boundaries between science and supernatural practice. The solution came through connections established during Damien's years at Grimthorne Academy. Dr. Johannes Mercator, a scholar whose research into parallel dimensional theory had been suppressed by the Church, agreed to establish a private academy within Ravenscroft Manor itself. This institution, known to its students as the Collegium Umbra, brought together young people from across Europe whose bloodlines carried similar supernatural heritage. The Academy's curriculum defied conventional educational categories, integrating subjects that official universities would not acknowledge for centuries. Mathematics lessons XMLs explored geometric principles that could be used to create stable portals between dimensions. Language studies included communication with entities whose thought processes operated according to non-human logic. Natural philosophy investigated the properties of matter in states that existed beyond solid, liquid, and gas, encompassing forms that required supernatural perception to observe. Lucian excelled in theoretical studies that dealt with the manipulation of probability and causality. His essays on the malleability of past events and influence patterns in non-linear time demonstrated understanding that challenged his instructor's grasp of temporal mechanics. His practical examinations involved successfully altering minor historical events through carefully calculated interventions, creating ripple effects that proved his mastery of cause and effect relationships that operated across multiple timelines simultaneously. Serafina's interests focused on the practical application of supernatural principles to solve physical world problems. Her projects included the development of materials that maintained their structural integrity while existing in quantum superposition states, allowing them to be simultaneously solid and gaseous until observation forced them to adopt specific characteristics. Her work with biological enhancement produced techniques for accelerating healing that surpassed even her natural abilities, creating methods that could regenerate lost limbs and restore youth to aging subjects. The Academy's other students, while exceptional by normal standards, found themselves challenged to keep pace with the Ravenscroft twins' rate of advancement. Victor von Habsburg's son, Maximilian, specialized in alchemical transmutation that produced substances with properties that defied classification. The Blackwood daughter, Morgana, had inherited her family's ability to communicate with spirits, but enhanced it to include negotiations with entities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. These young people, educated together in subjects that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, formed connections that would influence European supernatural practice for centuries. Their collaborative projects produced innovations that their families had spent generations failing to achieve independently. But such concentrated supernatural education also attracted attention from entities that viewed this gathering of enhanced bloodlines as either a threat to be eliminated or an opportunity to extend their influence into the physical realm. If you could attend such an academy, would the promise of impossible knowledge outweigh the dangers of attracting otherworldly attention? In the winter of 1586, the Collegium Umbra faced its greatest test when rival supernatural factions launched coordinated attacks against the Academy, recognizing that the concentration of enhanced bloodlines represented either a threat to established power structures or an opportunity to seize control of capabilities that could reshape European civilization. The conflict that followed would be remembered in hidden histories as the War of Shadows, a battle fought simultaneously in the physical world and across multiple dimensional planes. The first assault came from the Order of the Black Sun, a Germanic organization that sought to harness supernatural forces for territorial expansion and political dominance. Their agents infiltrated the manor's grounds during the new moon of January, when protective wards operated at reduced effectiveness. These operatives possessed abilities that had been artificially enhanced through alchemical processes that sacrificed long-term stability for immediate power increases. Lucian detected the intrusion through his communion with entities that monitored dimensional boundaries, warning the Academy's defenders hours before the attack commenced. His ability to perceive multiple timeline probabilities allowed him to anticipate the invaders' strategies with accuracy that proved crucial to organizing effective countermeasures. The twins coordinated the Academy's response through their shared consciousness, dividing tactical oversight between physical world defenses and supernatural deterrence measures. The battle itself transcended conventional warfare, involving techniques that manipulated reality at fundamental levels. Serafina created barriers from crystallized air that proved impervious to both physical weapons and energy-based attacks. The Academy students worked together to generate illusions that confused the attacker's perception of space and time, causing them to experience the Manor's layout as a maze where corridors led to destinations that existed in different centuries. The conflict's most intense phase occurred when the Order's leadership attempted to summon entities from parallel dimensions to overwhelm the Academy's defenses. This operation required the sacrifice of their own operatives to provide the life force necessary for transdimensional summoning. The entities that responded to their call brought capabilities that challenged even the Ravenscroft bloodline's supernatural mastery. Damien and Evangeline joined the battle as the summoned entities began manifesting in physical form, their combined abilities proving barely adequate to contain forces that operated according to logic systems that human minds struggled to comprehend. The confrontation reached its climax when Cornelius, now 79 years old but still possessing formidable supernatural capabilities, activated protocols that had been prepared decades earlier for exactly such emergencies. The final resolution required a sacrifice that cost the Ravenscroft family more than victory should have demanded. Cornelius channeled the accumulated power of 3 generations of Bloodline enhancement into a working that banished the summoned entities while permanently severing the Order's connection to their dimensional sponsors. The effort proved fatal, his life force consumed in the process of protecting the Academy and its students. But his death also triggered transformations in the surviving family members that would enhance their abilities beyond anything they had previously achieved. Would you have stood with the Academy against such overwhelming supernatural forces, or sought safety in flight from conflicts beyond human comprehension? Cornelius Ravenscroft's death in defense of the Collegium Umbra triggered supernatural phenomena that transformed his funeral into an event that redefined the family's relationship with the otherworldly forces they had served for generations. His sacrifice had created a power vacuum that entities from multiple dimensions competed to fill, while simultaneously elevating his surviving descendants to levels of supernatural capability that surpassed anything documented in the family's archives. The funeral took place in the ancient stone circle where the family's supernatural legacy had been established, but the ceremony quickly transcended normal mourning rituals as Cornelius's accumulated life force began manifesting as autonomous energies that sought connection with his bloodline descendants. Damien found himself channeling abilities that his father had developed over decades, while Evangeline experienced visions that revealed family secrets that Cornelius had guarded even from his immediate family. Lucian and Serafina, now 17 years old, underwent transformations that accelerated their development beyond their parents' ability to guide or control. The twins' shared consciousness expanded to encompass awareness that extended across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, allowing them to perceive events that occurred in parallel versions of reality where different choices had been made by previous generations of Ravenscrofts. The enhanced abilities came with costs that became apparent within weeks of Cornelius's death. Damien began experiencing temporal displacement episodes where his consciousness would slide between different points in his personal timeline, sometimes speaking to family members as if decades had passed when only hours had elapsed. Evangeline developed sensitivity to emotional resonances that forced her to shield herself from contact with individuals whose psychological states created disturbances in the supernatural fields she could now perceive. The twins faced the most severe challenges as their expanded awareness brought them into contact with entities that existed in states of consciousness that human minds weren't designed to accommodate. Lucian's communications with otherworldly presences began including voices that claimed to be versions of himself from timelines where the Ravenscroft family had made different choices, creating conversations that blurred the boundaries between internal thought and external contact. Serafina's reality manipulation abilities increased to levels that made casual interaction with the physical world dangerous. Objects in her vicinity would spontaneously transform to match her subconscious preferences, creating environments that reflected her mental state with sometimes disturbing accuracy. During periods of strong emotion, her presence could cause structural changes in the manner that required conscious effort to reverse. The surviving students of the Collegium Umbra found themselves dealing with similar enhancement effects, their bloodline abilities amplified by exposure to the energy released during Cornelius's sacrifice. Several returned to their families carrying capabilities that surpassed what their ancestral lines had achieved over centuries of careful cultivation, but the enhancement also attracted attention from entities that had been blocked from direct interaction with the physical world by protective measures that Cornelius's death had disrupted. New threats were gathering, drawn by the concentration of supernatural capability that the Ravenscroft family now represented. How do you think you would cope with abilities that grew beyond your capacity to control, knowing that the price of power might be your humanity itself? By 1590, the enhanced Ravenscroft bloodline had attracted the attention of entities that offered partnership in projects that would extend supernatural capabilities beyond anything achieved by human bloodlines alone. These otherworldly presences proposed breeding programs that would create offspring incorporating genetic material from species that existed partially outside normal spacetime, producing children who could serve as bridges between dimensional realms. The negotiations took place in chambers deep beneath Ravenscroft Manor, in spaces that had been expanded beyond their original architectural limits through reality manipulation techniques that Serafina had mastered in the years following her grandfather's death. These meetings required preparation that included the creation of communication interfaces that could accommodate thought processes that operated according to non-human logic systems. Damien, now recognized as the family's primary decision-maker, found himself evaluating proposals that challenged his understanding of biological possibility. The entities offered to contribute genetic material that would enhance human capabilities in ways that natural evolution couldn't achieve, creating offspring who could manipulate matter at molecular levels, perceive across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, and communicate directly with the fundamental forces that maintained reality's structure. Evangeline's role in these negotiations proved crucial, as her enhanced sensitivity allowed her to detect deceptive elements in the entity's communications that might have escaped less gifted participants. Her analysis revealed that the proposed breeding program would indeed produce the enhanced cap, abilities promised, but would also create dependencies that would bind the resulting offspring to serve the entity's long-term objectives in ways that might conflict with human interests. Lucian and Serafina, now 18 and possessing abilities that surpassed their parents' enhanced capabilities, participated in the negotiations as equal partners rather than children requiring protection. Their shared consciousness allowed them to evaluate the entity's proposals from multiple perspectives simultaneously, identifying implications that single individuals might overlook. The twins' analysis revealed that the breeding program represented part of a larger strategy that multiple entity groups were implementing across Europe, with the ultimate objective of creating a hybrid population that could serve as intermediaries in conflicts between dimensional realms. The Ravenscroft family's bloodline had been selected not just for its supernatural capabilities, but for psychological characteristics that made them suitable for roles in conflicts that spanned multiple versions of reality. After months of negotiation, the family reached a decision that would determine their legacy for generations. They agreed to limited participation in the breeding program, but with modifications that would preserve human autonomy while gaining access to enhanced capabilities. The resulting offspring would inherit otherworldly abilities while maintaining sufficient humanity to resist complete domination by their non-human ancestors. The first hybrid children were conceived during the winter solstice of 1590, their development monitored by practitioners who understood that they were witnessing the emergence of a new form of consciousness that might represent either humanity's evolution or its replacement. The gestation period for these enhanced offspring would prove longer than normal human pregnancy, requiring nearly 2 years of careful management to ensure successful development. Tell me in the comments. Would you risk creating hybrid offspring to gain extraordinary abilities or reject such enhancement to preserve pure humanity? The hybrid offspring conceived during the winter solstice of 1590 were born during the lunar eclipse of November 1592, their arrival marked by phenomena that transformed Ravenscroft Manor into a focal point where multiple dimensional realms converged temporarily. The birthing process required preparation that extended far beyond medical considerations, involving the creation of environmental conditions that could support consciousness that existed partially outside normal space-time. Evangeline's labor lasted 5 days and 4 nights, her delivery taking place in chambers that had been modified to accommodate energies that normal architecture couldn't contain. The walls were inscribed with symbols that stabilized the intersection of multiple dimensional planes, allowing the hybrid children to transition from existence within the womb to independent life without losing connection to their otherworldly heritage. 3 children were born. Nathaniel, whose consciousness spanned multiple timeline variations simultaneously, Miranda, who could manipulate matter at molecular levels through direct mental interface, and Alexander, whose perception encompassed dimensional layers that existed beyond human sensory capability. Each child possessed abilities that transcended anything documented in supernatural bloodline records, their capabilities representing genuine fusion of human potential with otherworldly enhancement. The children's effect on their environment became apparent within hours of birth. Nathaniel's presence caused temporal fluctuations that allowed glimpses of past and future events to overlay present reality. Miranda's unconscious manipulation of molecular structures created materials that shouldn't have been able to exist under normal physical laws. Alexander's expanded perception generated interference patterns that allowed other family members to briefly see through his multidimensional awareness. The otherworldly entities that had contributed genetic material to the children's conception maintained monitoring contact that revealed the success of the breeding program while also demonstrating the entity's long-term investment in the offspring's development. These communications indicated that the hybrid children represented the first successful examples of a new form of consciousness that could serve as permanent bridges between dimensional realms. Lucian and Serafina, now serving as the hybrid children's primary caregivers due to their parents' ongoing diplomatic responsibilities with entity groups, found that their own abilities continued expanding in response to prolonged contact with their hybrid siblings. The twins' shared consciousness began incorporating elements of multidimensional awareness that allowed them to perceive the hybrid children's full capabilities while helping to manage the environmental disturbances their presence created. The village of Thornwick experienced phenomena during this period that forced the remaining population to acknowledge the supernatural forces operating in their vicinity. Livestock were born with characteristics that suggested genetic influences from species that official naturalists insisted didn't exist. Children began displaying psychic abilities that mimicked simplified versions of the hybrid children's powers. Most unsettling, several villagers reported dreams where they received instruction in techniques for enhancing their own bloodlines through carefully planned breeding programs. By 1594, it became clear that the hybrid children's influence was extending beyond the Ravenscroft family, creating genetic modifications in the local population that would be passed to future generations. Would you have stayed in Thornwick to witness this unprecedented evolution or fled to preserve your family's genetic integrity? By 1595, the success of the Ravenscroft hybrid breeding program had inspired similar projects across Europe, creating a network of enhanced bloodlines that maintained communication through methods that transcended conventional distance limitations. The hybrid children, now 3 years old and displaying abilities that required constant supervision to prevent reality disturbances, served as focal points for a supernatural communication network that connected enhanced families from Scotland to the Mediterranean. The network operated through what participants termed consciousness bridging, a technique that allowed enhanced individuals to share awareness across vast distances while maintaining their individual identities. Nathaniel's ability to exist across multiple timeline variations made him particularly effective as a network coordinator, his consciousness serving as a stable reference point that other participants could use to maintain coherent communication, despite the temporal distortions that multidimensional contact often created. Miranda's molecular manipulation abilities proved essential for creating physical artifacts that could serve as communication focuses for network members who lacked sufficient psychic capability for direct consciousness bridging. These objects, crafted from materials that existed in quantum superposition states, could transmit complex information across continental distances while appearing to casual observation as simple jewelry or decorative items. Alexander's multidimensional perception allowed him to monitor the network for security breaches, detecting attempts by hostile entities to intercept communications or influence network members through deceptive information insertion. His warnings proved crucial in preventing several infiltration attempts by organizations that sought to exploit the network's capabilities for political or military advantage. The network's activities included collaborative projects that no single family could have accomplished independently. Enhanced bloodlines in different regions shared research into genetic enhancement techniques, comparing results and refining methods that increased the effectiveness of supernatural breeding programs. Information about entity contact protocols was exchanged, allowing families to avoid dangerous partnerships while identifying entities that offered genuine mutual benefit. Most significantly, the network began coordinating responses to threats that targeted enhanced bloodlines specifically. The Order of the Black Sun's defeat had not eliminated organized opposition to supernatural bloodline enhancement, merely forced hostile organizations to adopt more subtle approaches that required sophisticated countermeasures. The Vatican's newly established Congregation for the Suppression of Unnatural Practices had begun investigating enhanced bloodlines across Europe, using methods that combined traditional religious authority with techniques borrowed from the very supernatural traditions they sought to eliminate. Their agents possessed abilities that suggested official church doctrine concealed deeper understanding of otherworldly forces than public teachings acknowledged. These investigators had identified the communication network's existence and were developing techniques for tracking its members through analysis of the psychic resonances that consciousness bridging created. Their success in locating enhanced bloodlines had already led to the disappearance of several families whose security precautions had proved inadequate against opponents who understood supernatural detection methods. The Ravenscroft family found themselves serving as primary coordinators for network security measures that would determine whether enhanced bloodlines could continue developing in secret or would face organized persecution that could eliminate centuries of careful genetic cultivation. If you discovered such a network existed, would you seek to join it for protection and knowledge, or report its existence to authorities to prevent supernatural influence from spreading? The winter of 1598 marked the beginning of coordinated persecution that would later be known in hidden histories as the Great Purge, as the Vatican's Congregation for the Suppression of Unnatural Practices launched simultaneous operations against enhanced bloodlines across Europe. Their success in identifying network communication patterns had provided target lists that included families who had maintained supernatural traditions in secret for centuries. The first strikes targeted isolated bloodlines whose security measures had been compromised through infiltration or betrayal. The von Habsburg family's Bavarian stronghold fell during a single night's assault, their alchemical laboratories destroyed and their enhanced bloodline members killed or captured for interrogation that revealed network communication protocols. The Blackwood estates in Scotland faced similar attacks, though several family members escaped through portal techniques that transported them to prepared refuges in dimensions that existed parallel to normal space-time. The congregation's agents demonstrated capabilities that indicated extensive study of the very supernatural techniques they claimed to oppose. Their weapons included blessed items that had been enhanced through processes that combined religious ritual with otherworldly energy manipulation. Their protective equipment provided shielding against psychic attacks while amplifying their own supernatural detection abilities. Most disturbing was their use of captured, enhanced bloodline members as unwilling assets in operations against their former allies. These individuals had been subjected to processes that bound their supernatural abilities to serve the congregation's objectives while maintaining enough consciousness to provide intelligence about network security measures and member capabilities. The Ravenscroft family's survival depended on defensive preparations that Cornelius had initiated decades earlier, recognizing that their supernatural prominence would eventually attract organized opposition. The manor's protective systems included wards that drew power from the ancient burial grounds beneath the property, creating barriers that could deflect both physical and psychic attacks. Lucian and Serafina coordinated network evacuation procedures that relocated vulnerable members to refugees that existed in dimensional spaces where normal persecution methods couldn't reach them. Their shared consciousness allowed them to maintain communication with evacuated families while monitoring congregation movements across multiple countries simultaneously. The hybrid children, now 6 years old, demonstrated defensive capabilities that surpassed their parents' enhanced abilities. Nathaniel's timeline manipulation allowed him to create temporal zones where congregation attacks were delayed or redirected to occur when defensive preparations were optimal. Miranda's molecular control enabled her to transform the manor's structure into configurations that confused attackers' navigation while providing advantages to defenders. Alexander's multidimensional awareness proved crucial in detecting congregation infiltration attempts before they reached operational stages. His warnings allowed the network to intercept several operations that would have eliminated key bloodlines whose loss might have caused the entire communication system to collapse. But the congregation's resources seemed inexhaustible, their operations suggesting support from entities that possessed capabilities comparable to those that enhanced bloodlines had cultivated through centuries of careful development. The conflict was evolving into something that transcended Anne versus human persecution, becoming a war between different visions of humanity's future development. Tell me in the comments, in such a conflict, would you support enhanced evolution or traditional humanity, and what would you sacrifice to defend your choice? Faced with extinction at the hands of the Vatican's supernatural Inquisition, the surviving enhanced bloodlines formed an unprecedented alliance in 1600, combining their accumulated knowledge and capabilities to create defensive measures that could match the congregation's seemingly inexhaustible resources. The alliance, known to its members as the Covenant of Bloodlines, represented the first unified organization of European supernatural families in recorded history. The Covenant's formation required negotiations that reconciled centuries of territorial disputes and philosophical differences between bloodlines that had competed for influence over otherworldly entities. The Ravenscroft family's central role in the network communication system made them natural coordinators for Alliance activities, while their hybrid children's unique capabilities provided advantages that no other bloodline could match. Damien assumed leadership of the Alliance's military operations, coordinating defensive strategies that utilized each member bloodline's specialized abilities in combination rather than isolation. His experience with entity negotiations proved crucial in securing otherworldly support for the Alliance, though these partnerships required sacrifices that tested the moral boundaries even enhanced bloodlines had maintained. The Alliance's first major success came during the Siege of Prague, where congregation forces had trapped the Rosenberg bloodline in their ancestral castle. The rescue operation demonstrated coordination between multiple supernatural disciplines that created effects none of the individual bloodlines could have achieved independently. Temporal manipulation techniques delayed congregation reinforcements while reality distortion fields created escape routes through dimensional spaces that bypassed normal geography entirely. Evangeline's role in Alliance intelligence operations proved equally crucial, her enhanced sensitivity allowing her to detect congregation infiltration attempts while identifying captured bloodline members who retained enough autonomy to serve as information sources. Her techniques for extracting intelligence from psychic resonances that traumatized individuals provided warnings that prevented several catastrophic security breaches. The hybrid children's contributions to Alliance operations transcended anything their creators had anticipated. Their abilities had continued developing beyond the parameters that the original breeding program had established, suggesting that their otherworldly genetic contributions were activating capabilities that even their non-human ancestors hadn't fully understood. Nathaniel's timeline manipulation had evolved to encompass probability modification that could influence the outcomes of Alliance operations by ensuring that random factors favored desired results. His interventions during the Battle of Milan prevented the Medici bloodline's elimination by causing congregation equipment to fail at crucial moments, while Alliance members experienced improbable advantages in combat situations. Miranda's molecular manipulation had expanded to include biological modification techniques that could enhance Alliance members' capabilities temporarily or permanently, depending on the urgency of specific operations. Her work created enhanced soldiers whose abilities rivaled the congregation's artificially augmented agents while maintaining sufficient humanity to resist the psychological techniques that the Vatican's forces used to convert captured enhanced individuals. Alexander's multidimensional perception had developed into a strategic advantage that provided the Alliance with intelligence gathering capabilities that surpassed conventional espionage methods. His ability to observe congregation, planning sessions from dimensional vantage points that existed outside normal space-time made Alliance operations consistently effective while preventing surprise attacks that might have eliminated key bloodlines. But victory in individual battles couldn't address the fundamental challenge that the Alliance faced. The congregation's support came from entities whose capabilities transcended anything that human bloodlines, even enhanced ones, could match through accumulated development. If you led such an alliance, would you seek victory through increasing supernatural enhancement, or try to find peaceful coexistence with forces determined to eliminate your very existence? By 1605, the Covenant of Bloodlines recognized that conventional warfare against the congregation could not achieve lasting victory, as their opponents' otherworldly support provided access to resources that human capabilities, even enhanced ones, could not match indefinitely. The Alliance's survival required a strategy that transcended military operations, involving modifications to reality itself that would make enhanced bloodlines impossible to eliminate through persecution. The plan that emerged from Alliance discussions represented the culmination of everything that supernatural bloodlines had learned about manipulating fundamental forces that maintained the structure of physical existence. Rather than continuing to defend specific territories or bloodline communities, they would alter the basic conditions of human evolution to ensure that supernatural capabilities became part of normal development rather than rare exceptions requiring careful cultivation. The operation, codenamed the Great Working, required coordination between Alliance members across Europe during the solar eclipse of October 12, 1605. Each bloodline would contribute capabilities that had been enhanced through centuries of development, channeling their combined power through ritual processes that would introduce genetic modifications into the general population that could not be reversed through conventional persecution methods. The Ravenscroft family's role in the Great Working involved the sacrifice of accumulated power that represented 3 generations of supernatural development. Damien and Evangeline would channel their enhanced abilities into the working, knowing that the process would reduce them to normal human capability while ensuring that their contributions became part of humanity's permanent genetic heritage. The hybrid children faced the most significant sacrifice, as their unique capabilities made them optimal conduits for introducing otherworldly genetic modifications into human breeding populations. Nathaniel's timeline manipulation would create probability cascades that ensured the modifications spread beyond detection or prevention. Miranda's molecular control would integrate the changes at cellular levels that made them indistinguishable from natural variation. Alexander's multidimensional awareness would monitor the modification's progress across multiple reality layers to ensure successful implementation. Lucian and Seraphina's shared consciousness provided coordination between the various working components, their connection allowing them to maintain synchronization between Alliance operations across continental distances. Their success would mean the transformation of their unique bond into something that could be replicated by future generations, making psychic communication a normal human capability rather than a bloodline specialty. The Great Working commenced at the moment of total solar eclipse, when the alignment of celestial bodies created optimal conditions for reality modification. Alliance members across Europe began channeling accumulated supernatural capabilities into ritual processes that had been designed to introduce permanent changes to human genetic structure while remaining undetectable by the congregation's monitoring methods. The effects began manifesting within hours as individuals across Europe started displaying capabilities that suggested successful integration of enhanced bloodline characteristics into normal human development. But the working also attracted attention from entities that recognized the operation's potential to alter the balance between dimensional realms permanently. The success of the Great Working would determine whether enhanced human capabilities became part of natural evolution or whether supernatural bloodlines faced extinction despite their desperate gambit. Would you sacrifice your extraordinary individual abilities to ensure that future generations inherited supernatural capabilities as a birthright rather than rare exception? The Great Working's success came at costs that even the Alliance's most experienced practitioners had underestimated, as the process of integrating supernatural capabilities into normal human genetics created permanent alterations to reality that extended far beyond the intended modifications. The ritual's completion transformed the participants while simultaneously attracting the attention of entities that had previously maintained neutral stances toward human supernatural development. The immediate effects on the Ravenscroft family demonstrated both the Working's success and its unforeseen consequences. Damien and Evangeline found themselves reduced to normal human capability as anticipated, but their sacrifice had created a genetic legacy that would influence European bloodlines for centuries. Their normal children, born after the Working, displayed abilities that suggested successful integration of enhanced characteristics without the dependencies on otherworldly partnerships that had defined previous supernatural bloodlines. The hybrid children's transformation proved more complex than Alliance planners had anticipated. Rather than losing their extraordinary abilities, Nathaniel, Miranda, and Alexander found themselves permanently connected to the dimensional interfaces that the Working had created, becoming living bridges between normal human consciousness and the enhanced awareness that supernatural development could provide. Nathaniel's timeline manipulation had evolved into a form of temporal anchoring that stabilized the reality modifications across multiple probability streams, ensuring that the genetic changes would persist despite attempts to reverse them through supernatural intervention. His consciousness now existed simultaneously across multiple time periods, providing warnings about future challenges while maintaining the Working's stability through continuous temporal adjustment. Miranda's molecular control had integrated with the genetic modification process itself, allowing her to monitor and refine the changes as they propagated through human populations. Her awareness extended to every individual carrying the enhanced genetic markers, providing her with unprecedented understanding of how supernatural capabilities developed in different bloodline combinations. Alexander's multidimensional perception had expanded to encompass the full scope of the Working's effects across parallel reality layers, revealing that the genetic modifications had created variations in multiple versions of human history simultaneously. His role evolved into serving as a guardian who could detect and counter attempts by hostile entities to exploit the reality modifications for their own purposes. Lucian and Seraphina's shared consciousness had become the template for psychic communication capabilities that were beginning to manifest in children born after the Working. Their connection now served as a permanent communication network that linked enhanced individuals across Europe, creating a 4M of collective awareness that could coordinate responses to threats while maintaining individual autonomy. But the Working's success had also attracted opposition from entities that viewed human supernatural enhancement as a threat to established power structures across multiple dimensional realms. These forces began organizing countermeasures that would test whether the genetic modifications could survive challenges from sources that operated beyond human understanding. The congregation's persecution had been merely the beginning of conflicts that would determine whether humanity's enhanced evolution could establish itself as a permanent addition to reality or would face elimination by entities whose capabilities transcended anything human bloodlines had previously encountered. How do you think you would adapt to living in a world where supernatural abilities were becoming normal, knowing that this evolution had attracted the attention of forces beyond human comprehension? By 1610, the effects of the Great Working had established supernatural capabilities as part of normal human development across Europe. But the success of genetic enhancement had created responsibilities that bound the surviving Alliance members to serve as guardians for the evolving population. The enhanced bloodlines could no longer focus solely on their own advancement, having become stewards for humanity's supernatural evolution while defending against entities that sought to exploit or eliminate the modifications they had introduced. The Ravenscroft family's role in this new order reflected their central position in the Alliance's operations. Though Damien and Evangeline had sacrificed their individual supernatural capabilities, their knowledge of entity contact protocols and reality manipulation techniques made them crucial advisors for the network of enhanced individuals that the working had created. They established the Hidden College, a secret institution dedicated to training newly enhanced humans in the responsible use of capabilities that previous generations had required decades to master safely. The hybrid children had evolved into something beyond their original design parameters, their consciousness existing simultaneously in multiple dimensional layers while maintaining their connection to human society. They served as early warning systems for threats that operated beyond normal perception, their abilities allowing them to detect hostile entity movements years before such forces could implement operations against enhanced human populations. Nathaniel's timeline anchoring had become essential for maintaining the stability of reality modifications that continued propagating through human genetic lines. His consciousness monitored probability streams to ensure that the enhanced capabilities developed according to patterns that strengthened human potential rather than creating dependencies that hostile entities could exploit. Miranda's integration with the genetic modification process had evolved into a form of biological guardian work that protected enhanced bloodlines from corruption or degradation. Her molecular awareness allowed her to detect and counter attempts to introduce harmful modifications into human genetic development while ensuring that beneficial enhancements continued spreading throughout population groups. Alexander's multidimensional monitoring had expanded to encompass observation of entity activities across reality layers that existed beyond normal human perception. His warnings provided the enhanced population with advance notice of threats while identifying opportunities for beneficial contact with entities that genuinely supported human supernatural development. The network that Lucian and Seraphina's shared consciousness had created now connected thousands of enhanced individuals across multiple countries, providing coordination capabilities that allowed rapid response to challenges while maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent systematic persecution by authorities who couldn't understand or accept supernatural human evolution. But the most significant development was the emergence of children born to normal parents who displayed capabilities that surpassed even Alliance members' enhanced abilities. These individuals represented the next phase of human evolution, their gifts developing spontaneously without requiring the careful bloodline cultivation that previous generations had needed. The Great Working had succeeded beyond its creators' wildest hopes, but success had created obligations that would bind the Ravenscroft bloodline to serve as protectors for humanity's supernatural development for generations yet to come. Their curse had become their purpose, transforming them from seekers of individual power into guardians of human potential itself. Tell me in the comments, would you accept such responsibilities if it meant protecting humanity's evolution, even knowing it would bind your bloodline to eternal vigilance against otherworldly threats? 3 centuries after Cornelius Ravenscroft first set foot on Yorkshire soil, his descendant Eleanor Whitmore understood that the family's true legacy lay not in the accumulation of supernatural power, but in the transformation of humanity itself. As she sat in her cottage in 1847, watching morning mist roll across the moors toward the abandoned manor, she carried within her genetic code the culmination of centuries of careful bloodline development that had successfully integrated otherworldly capabilities into normal human inheritance. The manor's abandonment in 1817 had been strategic rather than accidental, as the surviving Ravenscroft bloodline had recognized that their work no longer required a fixed base of operations. The genetic modifications introduced through the Great Working had established self-sustaining patterns that continued propagating through European populations without requiring direct supervision. Enhanced individuals were being born naturally across the continent, their abilities manifesting as innate talents rather than cultivated skills. Eleanor's role as the last witness concealed her true function as coordinator for a network that now spanned multiple continents. Her cottage served as a communication hub for descendants of Alliance bloodlines who continued monitoring human supernatural development while protecting enhanced populations from entities that sought to exploit their capabilities. The children born in recent decades displayed abilities that transcended anything the original Alliance members had achieved through generations of careful enhancement. These individuals could manipulate probability, communicate across vast distances through mental connection, and perceive across multiple dimensional layers as naturally as normal humans used their five senses. But perhaps most significantly, they showed no signs of the psychological instability or otherworldly dependencies that had plagued earlier supernatural bloodlines. The genetic modifications had successfully integrated enhanced capabilities with human consciousness in ways that preserved free will, while providing access to abilities that previous generations could only achieve through dangerous partnerships with entities of questionable motivation. The Vatican's Congregation for the Suppression of Unnatural Practices had long since abandoned their persecution efforts, recognizing that supernatural capabilities had become too widespread to eliminate through conventional methods. Many church officials now quietly acknowledge that enhanced human abilities might represent divine gifts rather than demonic corruption, though such admissions remained unofficial policy. Eleanor's final revelation as she approached death was the understanding that the Ravenscroft curse had never been a curse at all, but a genetic imperative that drove her bloodline to serve as catalysts for human evolution. The tragedies that had befallen previous generations were birth pangs accompanying humanity's transformation, from a purely physical species to one capable of existing across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The price paid in blood and suffering had purchased humanity's ascension to a form of existence that transcended the limitations that had previously confined human consciousness to single timelines and physical bodies. As Eleanor drew her last breath, she knew that her family's true legacy would live on, not in the abandoned stones of Ravenscroft Manor, but in the enhanced capabilities that now flowed through human bloodlines across the world. The curse had become humanity's greatest blessing, and the Ravenscroft name would be remembered not for the darkness they had embraced, but for the light they had brought to human potential itself. I want to hear your theory in the comments below. Do you believe the Ravenscroft legacy represents humanity's natural evolution? Or did their supernatural enhancement come at a cost that future generations will still have to pay?